mom banned my husband from the wedding, then asked me for a loan when her business collapsed. I was halfway through the doorway when my mom said, "If you marry Brian, don't bother calling me mom anymore." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The venom in that one sentence was enough to freeze me in place. I remember standing there, literally between worlds. Behind me was the life I was building with Brian, and in front of me, the life she'd tried to script for me since I was a kid. I could almost feel the boundary line under my feet. For a split second, my heart pounded so hard I thought I might pass out. But I swallowed, forced myself to breathe, and took another step forward, away from her. If I'd known how bad things would get, I might have hesitated. But that night, all I felt was hurt and a rising storm of anger. I grew up in a quiet suburb in Illinois, in a two-story house with a neatly trimmed lawn. Mom, her name's Donna, always reminded me of a drill sergeant disguised as a real estate mogul. She built her brokerage from a ragtag collection of cheap properties into a mini empire, flipping houses and renting out units all over the county. My dad, Mark, used to joke that if she could find a way to squeeze more hours out of each day, she'd do it. But behind that unstoppable ambition was a short fuse and a certain pride that would never let her admit wrongdoing. Growing up, I'd seen her hold lifelong grudges over the pettiest things. A late rent payment from a tenant could earn them her wrath for years. The neighbor who once let his dog trample her roses never heard the end of it. The older I got, the more I understood that Mom's love was real but conditional. You played by her rules if you wanted to stay on her good side. My dad left when I was 10. For a while, I resented him for not taking me with him. But as I got older, I realized he couldn't keep up with my mom's demands either. He remarried and moved to New York, calling me on birthdays and holidays. Mom, meanwhile, funneled her energy into shaping me into a successful young woman. That meant advanced placement classes, early college credits, and the constant reminder that men come and go, but your career is forever. I guess it shouldn't have surprised me that she bristled at the idea of me marrying Brian, but I never imagined it would get as vicious as it did. I met Brian in college. He was that guy in the back of the lecture hall who always had a smirk on his face, like he was thinking of a private joke. We ended up working together on a final project for one of our business courses. Coincidentally, a project about real estate development. Turns out, he was from a small town in Montana, raised by a single mom after his dad passed away in an accident. He'd learned to fend for himself early, working odd jobs since high school. He wasn't wealthy, but he had a quiet determination that I admired. Unlike some of my classmates who seemed to see the world as a contest of who could accumulate the most money, Brian wanted to build something genuine and lasting, even if it took him longer or earned him less. When we got to know each other, we realized we shared values: humility, empathy, and a desire to make our own paths. Mom met him once, early in our relationship, and labeled him a well-meaning nobody. I remember how she dismissed his entire life story in 2 sentences. I know guys like him. They have good intentions, but they never become anything. I should have challenged her on it, but at the time, I still believed she just wanted the best for me. Brian tried to be polite and respectful, but she barely gave him the time of day. Over time, the tension between them hardened into something dense and immovable. Brian didn't like how she talked down to me, or to him. She wasn't used to men who challenged her, even in small ways. Every slight disagreement ignited into a drama, until I started dreading any interaction that involved the two of them. Things escalated when Brian proposed. We'd been dating for 3 years and living together in a modest apartment for about a year. He wasn't flashy about it. He popped the question in our living room on a Thursday night after we'd had cheap Chinese takeout, kneeling down in front of the coffee table. The ring was simple, and his hands were shaking. I said yes before he could even finish his little speech. It was perfect in its own unpretentious way. We called Mom to share the news, but she just said, "Oh," and went quiet. Then she mumbled something like, "We'll talk later," and hung up. A few days later, she asked me to come by her house alone. That's when she told me calmly, "You could do better, much better. Don't chain yourself to a man who can't provide the life you deserve." I tried to explain that Brian had a stable job. He was working as a financial analyst, ironically making more money than me. But in her eyes, it would never be enough. She wanted a power couple, someone who'd match her ambition, someone who'd build a dynasty. I said I wasn't interested in building an empire. She nearly slammed her fist on the table. It felt more like a business negotiation than a talk about my future happiness. From that point on, every wedding detail became a battlefield. Brian and I planned a small ceremony at a renovated barn outside the city. Rustic, romantic, and not too expensive. Mom wanted a grand affair in a high-end venue. She offered to pay for the difference if we'd just let her control the guest list, the decorations, and basically everything else. Brian was uncomfortable with letting her call the shots, and so was I. But I also felt guilty turning down her money. All that guilt melted away after one nightmarish dinner. We were at her house, going over decor options, and Mom commented that the barn was too common, too cheap. Brian said politely, "We'd prefer something more personal." Mom fired back, "Personal is code for cheap in my line of work. But sure, waste your wedding on your silly preferences." That remark made Brian's face go pale. He clenched his jaw and said nothing, but I could tell he was done trying to appease her. I told her if she couldn't respect our choices, we wouldn't need her help. She snapped that I'd regret it. That was the last wedding conversation we tried to have with her. I was naive enough to think she'd cool down eventually. Brian and I continued planning. We set a date, found a caterer we liked, ordered invitations. Mom seemed to drop off the radar, and I assumed she was just sulking. Then, about 2 weeks before the wedding, she called me late at night and said in a measured tone, "If you go through with this, you can forget about me being there. I'm not going to watch you ruin your life." I was shaking with a mix of anger and heartbreak. I told her if she wanted to miss her only daughter's wedding, that was on her. She hung up on me. It was the day before the wedding when I went by her house to pick up a box of childhood keepsakes I'd stored in her attic. She met me at the door with her arms folded. "So you're really doing this," she said. Her voice was disturbingly calm. Her eyes narrowed like a hawk. "Yes, Mom, I am," I replied, trying to project confidence. She stepped aside to let me in. And that's when she uttered the line I'll never forget. "If you marry Brian, don't bother calling me Mom anymore." I stood in her foyer, feeling numb. A small part of me wanted to break down crying. Another part wanted to scream at her for being so cruel. In the end, I simply left, box in my arms, tears burning my eyes. That night, I told Brian she wouldn't be at our wedding. He hugged me, tried to console me, but I couldn't stop thinking about how the happiest day of my life would also be overshadowed by the darkest kind of family rift. Our wedding was still beautiful. The weather cooperated, the barn smelled of fresh hay and wildflowers, and my college roommate officiated the ceremony. We had about 50 guests, close friends, a few relatives from my dad's side, and some of Brian's old friends from Montana. My mom's seat remained empty. I managed not to cry during the vows, but I did break down in the bridal suite afterward, once everyone had moved on to the reception area. Brian found me in there, sobbing into my bouquet. He held me and promised we'd be okay, that we'd build a good life and never push our future kids away the way my mom pushed me. I clung to him like a lifeline, trying to let the heartbreak run its course so I could go back out there and celebrate with everyone who did show up for us. In the months after the wedding, I tried not to think about my mother, but it was impossible to ignore how her absence left a hole in my life. I caught myself almost dialing her number when I had a small victory at work, or when I remembered something funny from childhood. Each time, I had to remind myself she wanted no part of my happiness if it included Brian. My dad flew in from New York a few weeks after I got married, and we had an awkward lunch where he half-heartedly tried to mediate. He told me he'd spoken to Mom and she sounded stubborn. That was putting it lightly. He said maybe she'd come around eventually, but I could see he didn't believe it. Meanwhile, Brian worked longer hours, got a small promotion, and we saved up to eventually buy our first home. An actual little house, not the condo or the big property my mom would have demanded. It felt like we were building a real foundation, even if it didn't meet her grand standards. I heard rumors through the grapevine that my mom's real estate business was struggling. The market in our area had shifted, competition was fierce, and she'd taken out big loans to fund new development projects. I didn't know details, but I got occasional texts from a cousin who still visited her. "She's stressed," he told me once, "like she's got the world on her shoulders." I assumed she'd bounce back. She always did. But about a year and a half after my wedding, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was my mom, sounding oddly small and subdued. "I need to talk to you," she said. "It's important." I braced myself for some new demand, maybe an attempt to reconcile on her terms. I met her at a nearby coffee shop, and the sight of her nearly shocked me speechless. She'd lost weight, her hair had more gray than I remembered, and her eyes looked tired behind smudged eyeliner. She wasted no time on pleasantries. "I lost almost everything," she said flatly. "Bad investments, a shifting market, underhanded partners. I messed up. Now the banks are after me." That was the first time in my life I'd heard her admit any kind of fault. She sipped her coffee with trembling hands and said, "I know I'm the last person you want to help, but I have no one else, and I'm running out of options." Turns out a big chunk of her real estate holdings had gone underwater when a major expansion failed. She took out hefty loans to cover costs, and her usual investors bailed. Everything was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, and she needed a significant sum of money just to cover the immediate debt. For a solid minute, I couldn't respond. My mind spun with all the memories of how she treated Brian, how she'd effectively exiled me for marrying him. And here she was, saying she had nowhere else to turn. It felt like cosmic irony. I managed to ask, "Why me? Why not friends or a business partner?" She shook her head. "Friends turn their backs when you can't pay them back. My ex-partners are the reason I'm in this mess. Your father isn't exactly flush with extra cash either. You might have some stability now." I almost laughed at the audacity. Sure, Brian and I had been careful with money, but we were hardly rich. I said, "Mom, do you realize how insane this is? You banned my husband from his own wedding, told me you wanted nothing to do with me, and now you're asking me for a bailout?" She opened her mouth, closed it, and stared at her coffee cup. "I know," she said, voice quavering slightly. "I know I've been horrible. I was just so convinced you were making a mistake. Then you went and proved you could succeed without me, and I didn't know how to handle it." Her eyes glistened, but I couldn't tell if it was genuine regret or just desperation. I told her I had to discuss it with Brian, and she nodded. On the drive home, I felt waves of anger, sadness, and a weird flicker of pity. This was my mother, after all. She'd raised me, bought my clothes, paid for my education, showed me how to bake cookies. Well, she mostly supervised while I tried not to burn them. Yet she'd also inflicted deep emotional wounds that still felt raw. Brian was predictably outraged when I explained the situation. "She can't just waltz back in because she needs money," he said. "We're not her ATM. She treated us like dirt." He was right, of course, but I also saw a chance, maybe the only chance, for some reconciliation. If we could find a middle ground, would it heal the rift? Or would she just take our money and vanish? After a few nights of tense discussions, Brian reluctantly agreed we'd offer a loan, but only if we set strict conditions: a written contract, a repayment schedule, and an acknowledgement that she had to respect our marriage. If she started insulting Brian again, if she tried to sabotage us, we'd withdraw all help immediately. I wasn't sure she'd accept, but it was the only way we could protect ourselves. So we arranged a meeting at our apartment. Mom walked in, clearly uncomfortable with the peeling wallpaper and the secondhand couch, as though it physically pained her to be in a less-than-fancy setting. But she sat down, folded her hands in her lap, and listened while Brian laid out the terms. Her mouth twisted slightly at the mention of repaying both of us, but she didn't argue. She signed the contract with a shaky breath. "Thank you," she said. "I promise I'll make this right." If I wasn't so wary, I might have believed her wholeheartedly, but I still carried the memories of her threats and ultimatums. Brian and I drained most of our savings to help her cover immediate debts. It hurt, not just financially but emotionally. I was furious that she'd forced me into this position, but some part of me also felt a tiny glimmer of hope. Maybe this was the beginning of her learning humility, of her finally seeing Brian as a decent person. As we trudged through the next few weeks, Mom's meltdown became more obvious. She let go of half her staff, sold off properties at a loss, and pleaded with banks for renegotiations. Each time I saw her, she looked more worn down. She'd speak in clipped sentences, but she'd keep her temper in check. I suspect she knew how fragile our arrangement was. If she dared revert to her old ways, we'd walk away, and she'd be done for. I spent hours on the phone, listening to her rant about shady investors, incompetent lawyers, and the system that wouldn't cut her a break. Every so often, she'd pause to say, "I really am sorry about the way I handled your wedding." Or, "You and Brian seem happy? I guess I should have trusted you more." She didn't quite manage a grand apology or a heartfelt confession of regret. But those small admissions were huge steps for someone as prideful as her. Brian remained reserved. He'd be civil when she'd drop by our place with papers for me to sign or updates on her repayment plan. She'd greet him stiffly, and he'd nod. I could sense the tension in the air. We were all walking on eggshells, waiting to see if this temporary truce would hold. Over time, some equilibrium emerged. She managed to salvage a portion of her business by partnering with a new investor who was willing to take on a chunk of her debt in exchange for a controlling share. She hated the arrangement. Losing majority control over her own company must have been the bitterest pill for her to swallow. But it kept her afloat. She started paying Brian and me back in small increments. When she handed me the first check, I noticed she'd scribbled "thank you" on the memo line. A simple gesture, but it made me tear up a little. I wondered if maybe she was genuinely trying to rebuild things between us, not just her business. We began talking more often, tentative phone calls about neutral topics like the weather or local events. The conversation never flowed freely, but at least we weren't screaming at each other anymore. One Saturday, out of the blue, she asked if we wanted to come by her house for dinner. Brian shot me a wary look, but I said yes, hoping it might be a step toward normalcy. The house seemed darker than I remembered, maybe because she'd removed some expensive art and furniture to sell off. She was in the kitchen trying to cook spaghetti with homemade sauce, something I'd rarely seen her do since she usually ordered takeout. The meal was slightly burnt, but none of us commented on it. Over that awkward dinner, we skated around the real issues. She asked Brian about his job. He explained that he was doing well, looking at potential promotions, saving for our first home. She nodded politely and didn't say anything critical. It was surreal. I almost expected her to snap, "See, I told you a big mortgage is a better investment." But she didn't. When we were done, she quietly cleared the plates and I got up to help. While we rinsed dishes in the sink, she said softly, "I know I can't fix everything overnight, but I'd like to try." My throat closed up for a moment and I just whispered, "Okay." There were setbacks. Sometimes she'd slip into her old controlling mode, dropping comments like, "Why would you waste money on that?" Whenever I mentioned a purchase Brian and I made, Brian would glare at me, silently questioning whether we should storm out. But each time, I'd calmly remind her that if she wanted to be part of our lives, she had to respect our decisions. She'd sigh or roll her eyes, but she'd back down. I never thought I'd see the day. Over the course of a year, we found a tentative rhythm. We had holiday dinners that weren't total disasters. She grudgingly admitted Brian was more capable than she first thought. He, in turn, softened slightly, though I could tell he'd never fully trust her. Meanwhile, Mom kept working on stabilizing her reduced business. She sometimes asked for my help with marketing or for my perspective on certain financial projections. When I asked her why she trusted my input, she said, "You're my daughter. You see things I don't." Maybe it was a corny line, but it warmed my heart a bit. She never specifically apologized for how she disowned me, but from the way she'd slump her shoulders or bite her lip whenever the topic of my wedding came up, I could tell she felt remorse. I think acknowledging that fact helped me move on, at least enough to function around her without flipping out every time I saw her. Brian and I eventually saved enough to buy a modest 2-bedroom house in a neighborhood we liked. When we told her, she actually congratulated us. No backhanded comment, no suggestion that we should have aimed higher, just a simple, "That's wonderful. I'm proud of you." I was stunned. I'm not sure if she meant it, but it felt like progress. The day we moved in, she came by with a bottle of mid-range champagne, much less fancy than what she'd normally pick. We shared a glass in our unfurnished living room, cardboard boxes everywhere. She looked around, gave a little nod, and said, "You're really doing it on your own terms, aren't you?" I nodded. "Yeah, we are." I think in that moment, a small part of her genuinely respected us for succeeding without her. A few weeks later, she called to tell me she'd sold the big house. She was downsizing to a smaller condo closer to the city. "It's time," she said. "That place is too big for just me." I imagined her in that huge empty house, pacing the hardwood floors at night, the echoes of her old empire swirling around. She didn't ask us to help her move. I think she was embarrassed enough already. But I offered, and she actually accepted. It was strange, boxing up decades of her life, expensive furniture, old photo albums, even some of my childhood trophies. Every time we stumbled on something personal, she'd pause, eyebrows knitted, like she was both proud and haunted by her memories. Brian carried out heavy boxes in silence, showing no sign of ill will, although I suspect he was privately reliving all the times she belittled him. At one point, I caught Mom watching him heft a giant mirror, her expression conflicted. Maybe she was silently acknowledging that he'd proven her wrong about the type of man he was. She continued making payments on the loan we'd given her, slowly but surely. One afternoon, she handed me an envelope with a final check. "This covers everything," she said quietly. My eyes burned with tears because I realized it symbolized more than just money. It meant she was no longer indebted to us. We stood there, unsure how to say what needed to be said. Finally, she reached out and squeezed my hand. "I know I've made mistakes," she managed, voice tight with emotion. "But I am grateful you and Brian. Foster, that you didn't turn your back on me." My chest felt tight. "Mom," I whispered, but my voice trailed off. She nodded, as if to say she understood. With the debt paid, we could have parted ways. I think there was a time when Brian would have preferred that we cut her off entirely. But something else had grown in the space of that obligation, a fragile, new respect between us. She never fully apologized for banning him from the wedding. Maybe she was too ashamed or still believed she was doing what was best. But she did start including him in conversations about the future. Even if it was just a casual, "Brian, what do you think?" at Sunday lunch. I'd catch him raising an eyebrow at me, almost as if he couldn't believe it. And I couldn't either. I'm not going to lie and say everything wrapped up in a neat little bow. My mother is still who she is, a headstrong woman who believes success is everything. I'm still struggling to forgive her for missing my wedding. and Brian still keeps an emotional wall around him whenever she's near. But there's a cautious piece now. We can share a holiday meal, talk about normal life stuff, even swap stories about the real estate market. Occasionally, she'll slip up and say something condescending, but it's more absent-minded than malicious. And if we call her out, she'll at least try to correct herself. It's a far cry from the vicious condemnation she threw at us before. About 2 years after we bought the house, Brian and I decided to renew our vows in a small backyard ceremony. We invited just a handful of friends and family. I never intended to invite my mom. Some habits die hard. But Brian urged me to consider it, saying, maybe this time she'll show up. So I did. I mailed her a formal invitation, half expecting her to call and criticize the idea. Instead, she texted back, I'd love to come. On the day of the renewal, she arrived quietly, wearing a simple dress, carrying a small bouquet of white roses, my favorite. I stood near Brian under a makeshift arch of fairy lights, my heart pounding as she took a seat in the front row. We exchanged vows again, this time in an atmosphere of calm acceptance. When we were done, my mom was the first one to clap, her eyes shiny with emotion. Maybe she was remembering the ceremony she missed, the seat she left empty when she banned Brian from my wedding day. In that moment, though, I let go of the anger, or at least I let it settle into something less poisonous. Later, she approached us, handed me that bouquet of roses and said, you two look really happy. I caught the tremor in her voice, the unspoken apology floating between us. Brian smiled, genuinely, and replied, we are. And for the first time in years, I saw no resentment or judgment in her gaze, just acceptance. She stayed at the party longer than I thought she would, chatting with Brian about real estate trends, without a trace of her former contempt. By the end of the evening, I actually felt an odd sense of closure. We weren't magically healed, but I could see a future where my mother wouldn't always be the villain in my life story. It's amazing how quickly everything changed. From the day she declared Brian unwelcome at my wedding, to the moment she quietly joined us for the vow renewal. The journey in between was harrowing, full of anger, tears, betrayal, and the strangest financial entanglement I'd ever imagined. But maybe that's just life. Sometimes it throws you into impossible situations, forcing you to confront your demons. Mom lost her empire, and in doing so, discovered she needed me more than she wanted to admit. Brian and I had to decide whether we could handle such a toxic dynamic. We stumbled, we raged, and we made choices that were painful but necessary. And in the end, we found a sort of fragile peace. It's not perfect, but it's ours. I don't know what the future holds. Part of me worries she'll revert to her old ways the minute she feels secure again. Another part of me believes she's learned something real about humility and the value of family. For now, I'm letting myself feel hopeful. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that family isn't about unconditional acceptance of bad behavior. It's about setting boundaries, meeting in the middle, and still trying to build something worthwhile despite all the broken pieces. Brian and I never needed her money or her approval to be happy, but we accepted her apology the only way she could give it. Maybe that's enough. We survived the worst. And if my mom can stand there smiling at me and the man she once banned from our wedding, then maybe redemption is possible, even for someone as stubborn and proud as she is. All I can do is keep moving forward, loving my husband fiercely, and hoping that in time my mother learns to love us both the way she should have from the beginning.